Welcome, everyone. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and this is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. So today we're going to talk about the Camarena case in some detail. But before we do, one preliminary matter. So I have a 10-year-old daughter who is into acting and singing and music, and she apparently watched or listened to a couple of my videos. And she told me today that I'm too stiff and that I need to pretend that I'm just talking to her. So today, I'm going to do my best to be less stiff and pretend that I'm talking to Isabel. So, with that, Isabel, we're going to talk about the Camarena case today for a couple of reasons. And I point these out because I know in the first video we did, we discussed it a little bit. But there's two reasons I want to talk about today. Number one is it is a seminal event in the history of the cartels in Mexico. As we've intimated before, so much that's happening now, so much that's happened over the years with respect to cartels can be traced back to February of 1985 and the kidnapping and murder of Agent Camarena. So that's number one. Number two is, as many of you know, I have a podcast that talks about the Camarena case and has talked about the Camarena case extensively in great detail. I also have a book that talks about the case in great detail. And one of the things I want to make sure in these sets of videos on this channel is that you're getting the content that you want. And there are lots of things we could do with respect to the Camarena case. You know, we're not going to focus exclusively on the Camarena case ever, but there are lots of things that we could do. I have videos, I have pictures, I have descriptions of how the kidnapping actually took place. I have rebuttals to some of the conspiracy theories that exist with respect to the case. So what I'm going to ask you is a favor. At the end of this video, if you have thoughts on whether you'd like to see more with respect to the Camarena case, if you like more of what we're focusing on with the current cartels and things, let me know. I've asked once or twice, and I think I'm getting a good sense of where people are most interested. But let me know. I mean, it's really important to me that this be, a give and take in a two-way street. So I'd love to know what you're most interested in. All right, let's talk about the Camarena case. And when we were talking about the history of cartels, we talked a little bit about kind of the 1970s and what was going on there and the fact that there's always been some trafficking between Mexico and the United States. And then we talked about a gentleman by the name of Pedro Aviles Perez. He was kind of the old school OG drug trafficker in Sinaloa. He was one of the first to really start pushing marijuana into the United States. He apparently was the very first to use an aircraft to do that. So that's kind of, part of his role. There were lots of other traffickers at this time. He was one of the bigger ones, one of the more prominent ones. But why he's important for this particular discussion is the three people we're going to talk about next all were either related to and or worked with Aviles Perez. All right. And all three at one point or another said much of what they learned about drug trafficking, they learned from Aviles Perez. So he's important in that regard. Now, he gets killed in a shootout with federal police in September of 1978. And around that time, lots of the drug traffickers started to move into Guadalajara. Why Guadalajara? Because it was a city. It was a whole lot nicer than the places that they were coming from. It was a growing city. It had nightclubs. It had discos. It had restaurants. It had girls. If you were a drug dealer with money, it was a great place to go. And the weather was perfect. So lots of them moved into Guadalajara. Now, there was something people have referred to as the Guadalajara narcotics cartel. And I've said this before here, said it a lot in other places. The Guadalajara narcotics cartel never existed. It was never a thing. Okay? That term was never used until after the Camarena case. Rather than a cartel, what you had is a loose affiliation of somewhat connected drug traffickers. In that regard, they helped each other when it was good for them, and they didn't when it wasn't good for them. Okay? There are three in particular. Now, as I just said, in Guadalajara, there were lots and lots of traffickers. It was an upgrowing time. There was lots going on, lots of traffickers, but three important ones for our conversation, and we'll show you pictures of all three of them. So the first one to talk about is Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, El Padrino, the Godfather. Felix Gallardo had taken some college classes in business. He had been a bodyguard for the Sinaloa governor. He had political connections. And he, along with a Honduran by the name of Juan Mata Ballesteros, or Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, if you will, were the first ones to really connect the cocaine in Central America, primarily Colombia, and a distribution route through Mexico into the United States. And the control of that flow of narcotics, that flow of cocaine from South America through Mexico into the United States, was something that made Felix Gallardo very powerful and very rich. Okay? So that's number one. Number two is a man by the name of Ernesto Fonseca, or Fonseca Carrillo. Ernesto Fonseca, Don Neto, was a prominent drug dealer drug trafficker in Mexico for many years. He got a start in the 70s. He's older than both Felix Gallardo and the next person we'll talk about. He had some time in Central and South America working in the drug trade. And he had a lot of what I'll call old school knowledge that he brought to, this loose affiliation of traffickers. One thing I should have mentioned early on is there is the movie Narcos Mexico. There's others too, but Narcos Mexico in particular. It's a drama. Please, please, please don't think that it's a documentary or that it's completely factual. But one of the things I wanted to point out with respect to Don Neto is in the movies, he kind of gets portrayed as, I think, as kind of schlumpy and maybe not super bright. I'm told two things. Number one, I'm told that he was very smart and especially street smart. I mean, he knew what he was doing in his area. Number two, he dressed really well, and there are stories that he was always in a suit and tie. And one other story is that a DEA agent who went to meet with him in prison after the Camarena case said he showed up to talk to him in silk pajamas. So I think that's an interesting one where I just think the portrayal of him in the movies and in Narcos Mexico in particular doesn't quite fit with the regular person or the real person. All right, then the third in this trio of folks that we want to talk about is Rafael Caro Quintero, the youngest of the three, probably the flashiest, the most flamboyant, the most out there. You'll see other movies that portray him, going through Mexico, shooting up, or through Guadalajara, shooting off guns, and I think all of that is great TV, but not really rooted in much fact. Caro Quintero, though, did a couple of things. Number one is he apparently was very charismatic. People liked him. Girls liked him. Men liked him. Men worked for him. Men wanted to work with him. He could organize. He could mobilize people. The other thing is he gets credit for being the first in this regard. And he certainly, I don't think, was the first. I don't think he was the only one, but he was maybe one of the more prominent ones to start growing marijuana on these massive plantations. I mean, massive plantations. And a lot of them were way out in the desert, places that people weren't really looking, and they were enormously successful. So those are the ones you have as far as the drug dealers. The DEA had various offices in 1984 and 85 and before, but for our purposes, 84, 85, there were offices in different places, including Mexico City and including Guadalajara. Now, the DEA in Guadalajara always was a very small office, 3, 4, 5 people at any time. As we've talked about before, it was an interesting time for them. They couldn't carry weapons, at least they weren't supposed to. They couldn't arrest people. They really couldn't interrogate people. If they went on raids, they went on raids with Mexican police officers, many of whom were on the take. Their role was to try to obtain information through confidential informants and otherwise, and then pass that information on to the Mexican authorities and try to assist them in utilizing the information to arrest or otherwise interact with the traffickers. One of the agents there was Kiki Camarena. And I won't go through his entire biography, but Kiki Camarena was born in Mexicali, but raised in Calexico, right across the border in California. He joined the Marines. He got out of the Marines, ended up, after a couple of other stays in law enforcement, in the DEA, and eventually ended up in the DEA office in Guadalajara. And I should be better about saying Kiki. Enrique Camarena was his name. He went by the nickname Kiki, so I'll use that, and I mean no disrespect when I do. So 1984 comes along. You've got a small DEA office in Mexico. Agent Camarena, who by all accounts was a very good, very aggressive, somebody who wanted to do his job. He was a really good agent. Because he was from Mexico, again, he was born in Mexicali, he was raised in a border town. He kind of understood the Mexican people in Guadalajara, including the traffickers and the cops, as good or better than any of the other agents. And that allowed him to really have a good rapport with them. And if you talk to people who knew him, it's one of the things they talk about on a regular basis. And because of this, Agent Camarena was fairly successful. He was able to help them find some plantations, some areas of growth, help the Mexicans identify some of the traffickers, etc. We get to November of 1984, and there is a raid on a plantation in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, outside of Buffalo, that's called Rancho Buffalo. Right? And this is the biggest marijuana plantation anybody's ever seen, before, since, ever will see. Enormous, 7,000 employees, tremendous amount of infrastructure that went into it. Huge. I've been in Kansas. I live in Colorado. I've been to North Dakota where there's wheat fields everywhere. This is a huge plantation, all right? And it gets raided in the first week of November of 1984. Now, to be very, very clear, at most, Agent Camarena provided the initial intelligence that led to further investigations into Rancho Buffalo, which then eventually led to the raid on Rancho Buffalo. Okay? He did not go undercover at Rancho Buffalo, like Narcos says. He was not responsible for finding Rancho Buffalo, right? As far as a real investigative process, he was not involved in the raid on Rancho Buffalo. His connection to Rancho Buffalo is minimal at best. No question, okay? That is an absolute fact. So, what happens after Rancho Buffalo? Things start heating up, all right? Lots of activity, lots of things with the cartels. In December of 1984, 4 American missionaries are picked up off the street in Guadalajara and eventually killed. The story, keep in mind, that this and the next thing we're going to talk about, the investigations were conducted by the Mexican authorities, not the DEA, nobody from the U.S., only the Mexican authorities. So the story that is told is that the missionaries inadvertently knocked on the door of a house owned by Ernesto Fonseca, and there was a fear that they were DEA or otherwise had found out where Fonseca lived and was going to share that with the DEA. And as a result, all four were picked up and killed in very gruesome ways. Okay. I don't believe that narrative. But the fact of the matter is that the four Americans were picked up and killed by Fonseca and or Caro Quintero and people working for them. Particularly Fonseca and Caro kind of worked together. A lot of the people, the bodyguards and things who worked with one also interacted with the other. So you've got the four missionaries. Then in January of 1985, two Americans, last names of Walker and Radelat, and again, not going into too great of detail, but apparently they're, out about in Guadalajara. They decide to go into a restaurant and they walk into La Langosta. Again, the story is that they walk into La Langosta and lo and behold, there is a cartel. I hate that word. There is a traffickers meeting going on that includes Caro Quintero and some of his top lieutenants. And as a result, they see these two gringos walk in. They think they're DEA and they get killed, again, in very gruesome ways. I also don't believe that narrative. But you have those two individuals who were killed almost undoubtedly by people working with or for Caro Quintero. Okay. So you've got that happens. And see, this is me being loose. I'm adjusting my seat. What happens next? Some would say that emboldened by the fact that they were able to kill the four missionaries and then the two Americans at La Langosta, the traffickers decide that they need to find and talk to the DEA agent that's causing them problems. Okay? When you listen to witnesses or alleged witnesses, or the term that comes up a lot is causing us problems. So now we fast forward to February 7, 1985. By this time, Agent Camarena had already been approved to move back to San Diego from Guadalajara. He was cutting his time in Guadalajara short and was going to move with his family back to San Diego. That transfer was going to occur sometime later in February, maybe as little as 10 days from the date of February 7. So, February 7, 1985, Agent Camarena is working in his office. Sometime in the morning, he gets up, goes out of the consulate, walks to a bank, does some banking, comes back. Nothing important happens. Later in the afternoon, early afternoon, Agents Kirkendall and Batchelier, and Agent Kirkendall, Jaime Kirkendall, was the resident agent in charge of that office. So Batchelier and Kirkendall walk across the street from, it's kind of catty corner, they walk across the street to a restaurant called the Camelot. Okay? Right across the street, and there they met with a confidential informant and his family. Camelot is important because the agents met there a lot, but more importantly, for these purposes, they park their cars in front of Camelot quite often, as opposed to using the the consulate parking, which would have been way up and around the corner. But because they used the Camelot so often, the owners let them be there. And in fact, that morning on February 7th, Agent Camarena had parked there, and then right behind him, Agent Kirkendall had parked. Anyways, about 1 o'clock, Batchelor and Kirkendall go down to the Camelot. They're talking to this informant. They need some money. They call the DEA office, and Agent Camarena walks across the street carrying some money to pay this informant. After just a couple minutes there, Agents Kirkendall and Camarena walk back across the street to the American consulate. Okay. A few minutes later, probably about 1:45 p.m., Agent Batchelor walks back to the American consulate. All this timeline, all these facts, absolutely conclusively can be proven, okay? About 2:05, something like that, shortly after 2 o'clock, Agent Camarena stands up and says, crap, I'm late. I'm supposed to meet Mika, his wife, for lunch. So he leaves the American consulate, walks across the street to the Camelot, or towards the Camelot, and is never seen again. Now, we know that when his truck was viewed later, his truck was unlocked, which everybody who I've talked to, and I've talked to people who worked with Camarena, okay, not just one, but others, said completely unusual. You would always lock. And his radio's in his car. So the belief is that he got to his truck, was opening up the truck, or close to doing that, was approached on the street by 3 or 4 men. And again, we can go into great detail on this. And kidnapped. Now, he could have been opening his truck, or he could have said, when approached, because the story is that somebody said, hey, the Commandant wants to see you. Camarena said, great, no problem. Let me just let my office know. And it could have been then that he opened the truck or unlocked the truck, and you know, lots of different ways this could play out. And again, if we want, we can go into great detail. One of the things that you should know as a side note is none of the witness statements of people who've testified later on in the case, we'll talk about them, but none of the witness statements match these facts that we've put out. Okay. But that's basically what happened. So Camarena is then abducted. He's put in a Volkswagen Atlantic, very small car, and driven to a residential neighborhood in Guadalajara. The address of the house that he goes to is 881 Lope de Vega, often just referred to as Lope de Vega. I can't really see it too good because there's a big fence, a white fence around it, and it's been remodeled. It now actually is a Montessori preschool. Been totally remodeled inside, and the pool taken out and tennis courts taken out, but it's a Montessori preschool. And I've talked to people who worked there and things, and it's just kind of bizarre to me. But he's taken to 881 Lope de Vega for at least some period of time. Now, when he's there, he is interrogated, and those interrogations are taped, recorded in some manner. And a couple of interesting things about the interrogations, and they're brutal. All right. I mean, he was treated horribly. It was really a torture, and they're terrible things to listen to. But we know a couple of things from them. Number one, there are different people, different voices of interrogators. At least 3, maybe more. The first person to interrogate him seems to be somebody with more of an intelligence background or a police background. He's more methodical. Camarena once refers to him as commandant. So there seems to be an element of respect. And there's the supposition that he knew who he was. Okay? During the trials in the United States on this case, and we'll talk about those, there was testimony by at least two people that one of the interrogators, one of the voices on the tapes, is Caro Quintero himself. Okay? We can talk again at a different time as to whether that really fits or not, but that was the testimony. As the tapes continue, as the torture goes on and on, they get much harder to understand. People are talking over each other, and it's hard. But in general, there's a lot of questions about Rancho Buffalo, about what the DEA knew, how they knew it, who their informants were, those types of questions. The types of questions you would expect drug traffickers to ask of the agent they said was, quote, causing them trouble. Okay. There's another victim in this case that gets overlooked a lot. Captain Alfredo Zavala Avalar was a pilot who worked for the Mexican government for the agricultural department, and he also would occasionally fly DEA agents on reconnaissance missions. He had worked extensively with Agent Camarena. He also was not directly involved in Buffalo in any material way, but he was picked up the same day as Agent Camarena. He had been at the Guadalajara airport. He was picked up. He was taken to Lope de Vega, and he also was tortured, interrogated, and eventually killed. So at some point, both Camarena and Zavala are killed. They're taken to Primavera Park, which is outside of Guadalajara, on land probably owned by Caro Quintero, and buried. Okay. So the next morning it becomes clear that Agent Camarena is missing. Almost immediately after that, the DEA office in Guadalajara gets a call from Captain Zavala's family and says that he's been kidnapped, and there becomes a massive manhunt. So you have agents from Mexico City and other places, agents, including DEA and FBI agents from the United States, all come down to Guadalajara, and there is a massive search for Agent Camarena. Okay. One of the things that happens during this first period is Caro Quintero leaves the Guadalajara airport on a jet plane. Do not believe the stories you have seen. All right. A couple of things. There were 5 to 7 folks involved on the, as far as there's supposed to be this confrontation between DEA agents and DFS agents. And at one point, in an interview, Hector Boreas has said there were 50 DFS agents pointing, machine guns at him. And there weren't. There were 5 or 6 or so. The other thing that's really important to know, super important to know, is at that time, nobody knew what Caro Quintero looked like. The DEA did not have a picture of Caro Quintero. So when this guy shows up, the DEA agents there, who'd gone to the airport because they'd heard that Caro might be leaving, they saw this guy. They knew he was a trafficker just because of the way he looked and stuff, but they did not know for sure it was Caro Quintero. And the story that somebody from the DFS, the Commandant Pavan Reyes came up and said, hey, I can't let you take Caro Quintero, didn't happen. Nobody knew it. And I say that knowing that for a fact because I've talked to DEA agents who were there. Nevertheless, Caro Quintero does get on the plane. And again, there's the famous line where he says, he sticks his head out of the jet before it leaves and says something along the lines of holding a champagne bottle. Next time my children bring better guns or bigger guns. The DEA agent that I've talked to, or one of them who was there, said to me, Jack, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I don't remember it. But, all right, Caro gets on a plane. Apparently he goes to Caborca, which is kind of like his second home, has a lot of family there, and then eventually ends up in Costa Rica. Ernesto Fonseca flees to Puerto Vallarta with a whole group of folks, and Felix Gallardo kind of hunkers down and stays quiet. March 4 and 5. All kinds of pressure had been applied to the Mexican government to try and find Camarena, or at a minimum recover the bodies. At one point, the borders were completely shut down, which caused enormous issues. There ends up being a gunfight at a ranch, a Moreno ranch, with the Bravo family. Everybody believes that gunfight was completely staged by the DFS and by the Mexican police to try to create a pretext for an investigation around that ranch. And DFS, by the way, is kind of a national police force, had been set up by the CIA, kind of referred to oftentimes as the Mexican equivalent of the CIA, except they worked domestically. In any event, Americans from the DEA, including Shaggy Wallace, go out to the ranch. They look all around. They find nothing. Turns out that later in the day, a farmer, found the two bodies wrapped in plastic. Two bodies were later identified as Camarena and Captain Zavala. Camarena had at least 3 autopsies, all of which are slightly inconsistent with each other, but it becomes incredibly clear from the soil and stuff that they were buried in one place, moved to another. So that's March of 85. April of 85, Caro Quintero gets arrested in Costa Rica and is flown back to Mexico. Fonseca is arrested in Puerto Vallarta with a large group of folks. He is brought back to Guadalajara or to Mexico City for trial. Felix Gallardo actually kind of stays under the radar for quite a while until he's also arrested in April, but this time in April of 1989. Kind of funny that they're all arrested in April. All of them end up being convicted in Mexican court for a variety of crimes, some of which are not directly related to the Camarena case. So it's more drug trafficking and those sorts of things, as opposed to participation in the murder of Agent Camarena. Now, there are 3 trials in the United States relating to Agent Camarena's case. The first trial occurs in San Diego in 1989. It involved a few folks, including Rene Verdugo. And the testimony there is much more is streamlined. It's people who could be proven to be at Lope de Vega. Then in 1990, there is the first trial in Los Angeles Federal Court in front of Judge Edward Rafiti. This trial involves a few different people and, more importantly, a different scope. So you have a trial here, Ruben Zuno Arce. Ruben Zuno was a Mexican national. His family was very well known, very wealthy, very prominent in Guadalajara. He had at one time owned the house at 881 Lope de Vega. Okay. Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, who I talked about, was another defendant, as were Javier Vasquez Velasco and Juan Jose Bernabe Ramirez. The difference here is this trial talked about a massive conspiracy to commit the murder of Agent Camarena, to pick him up. a man by the name of Hector Cervantes Santos was the main witness in this trial, and he provides testimony. There are others, but basically it's Cervantes who provides testimony that there were several meetings, and there were elements of the traffickers and Mexican politicians and the Mexican military that all conspired to pick up the agent that was causing them trouble. Okay, so that trial starts May 15, 1990. There is a conviction. Ruben Zuno moves for a new trial on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct. Really what it was, misconduct might be a little bit of a pejorative term. There was a piece of evidence that was kept out of the proceedings for a particular reason, and on closing arguments, the prosecution referred to that evidence in a way that the defense had not been able to rebut. As a result, there's a new trial granted. That goes up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and is affirmed. Then there's a second trial. Okay, so that we'll call Zuno 2. Interestingly, in the intervening period between Zuno 1 and the beginning of Zuno 2, Hector Cervantes Santos recants, unrecants, re-recants, is found to be completely and totally incredible. So he can't appear as a witness. All of a sudden, the government has two new witnesses who testify in Zuno 2. Those are Jorge Godoy and Rene Lopez Romero. They were two former cops who worked as bodyguards for Ernesto Fonseca. They provide testimony that's very different than Cervantes. They still talk about this massive conspiracy, but they have different dates, different people, different places. Cervantes, again, never called as a witness. Again, Ruben Zuno is convicted. There was another person involved in that second case. That would have been Dr. Humberto Alvarez Machain. Dr. Machain was a doctor who's a gynecologist, a big, large guy who hung around with the traffickers, apparently because he liked parties and he liked the women that came with it. And it's said that he would administer medication to the traffickers and their friends when they'd have these massive parties. Dr. Machain was undoubtedly, by his own admission, at Lope de Vega at least once when Agent Camarena was there. He was charged with conspiracy, and it was alleged that he had injected Agent Camarena with lidocaine to kind of keep him alive during the interrogation and the torture. His case was dismissed on a motion to dismiss at the conclusion of the government's case, and Judge Rafiti found that the government had done nothing to prove that Humberto Machain, Dr. Machain, had done the things they said he did, and Judge Rafiti really said that it was all just conjecture and supposition. So he's eventually released. You know, his case is interesting because he was literally kidnapped off the streets of Guadalajara, taken to El Paso, and almost, probably some of this is a more urban legend than actually true, but almost thrown out of a rolling plane in El Paso. Nevertheless, as I said, Ruben Zuno is convicted. Dr. Machain goes back to Mexico. His case ends up going up to the U.S. Supreme Court a couple of times. Ruben Zuno goes through a set of appeals. Those are all denied, and he died in prison several years ago. That, my friends, is the shortest version of the Camarena case I can provide. Now, not going into detail, but we know that there have been allegations regarding the Camarena case. In particular, Amazon Prime put out a 4-part series that purported to be a documentary about the case that starred, I'm going to use that in quotes, Agent Hector Boreas, who, starting in the 90s, worked for Operation Leyenda, and at times was the head of Operation Leyenda, and 3 witnesses, Jorge Godoy and Rene Lopez Romero, who we've talked about, and then another one, Ramon Lira. The really important points to come out of that series are the allegations. Number one, that the CIA was directly involved in the kidnap, interrogation, and murder of Agent Camarena, that the CIA acted in the person of Felix Rodriguez, who is infamous in those circles. And a third allegation was that Jaime Kuykendall, Camarena's boss, somehow was involved with the traffickers. Okay? I've spent considerable time demonstrating why I think all of those claims are false, are patently false, and that much of the specific allegations they use to support the grander allegations are inconsistent with the evidence and are also false. Okay. But that is still out there, and there certainly are a number of folks who continue to believe that the CIA was somehow involved. All right. Once again, that's as short as I could make it. We can go in lots of ways. If people are interested, the actual kidnapping of where it was, I've mapped it out. I've got a video of me being right where it was and being driven to Lope de Vega. We can talk about that. We can talk about the CIA. We can talk about Felix Rodriguez. Or we can go back to what we've been doing, and we're going to do this anyways. But we can spend a whole lot more time talking about the current situation, the current people, and maybe do a little bit more history and how we got from 1989 with Felix Gallardo, and his efforts to kind of distribute the territories to today. So all of that is on the table. Let me know what you want. And if you think I was looser today, if you think I talked to Isabel well, please let me know. Thank you for joining. Again, look for the podcast if you're interested. It's similar things, but not exactly the same. Also, I've got a book, Someone Had to Die. It talks extensively about the Camarena case. Look for it. And Jaime Kuykendall has a book about the Camarena case that is also very fascinating. Look that up as well. And that's it for today. I'll see you next time on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena.